Hello, I'm Ed Sullivan, the editor of Building Operating Management magazine. Welcome to today's webcast, Emergency Preparedness for Infection Control. We have two speakers today. Daniel Davies, CFM, is a facilities manager, South Mall Zone for the Smithsonian Institution's Office of Facilities Management and Reliability. Josh Elker is Director of Business Development for Sterilair, a leading provider of UVC solutions. We were originally planning to have a third panelist from ACP Facility Services. Due to the unfolding COVID-19 situation, they are unable to participate today. We will be sending everyone who is attending this webcast a copy of fact sheets from ACP that describe their processes for the cleaning and disinfection of areas either suspected to be contaminated or confirmed to be contaminated with the COVID-19 virus. Here are our learning objectives. We want to understand how viruses are transmitted in buildings, review principles for airborne infection control, and review the steps and a timeline followed by the Smithsonian Institution for responding to COVID-19 so far. I'd like to cover a few details about today's event. A live question and answer session will follow the presentation. To submit questions, please use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen and send your questions to all panelists. Our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. All participants will receive an email by the end of the day with a link to download a PDF copy of today's presentation slides. You will also receive a link to a brief online assessment. Once you have successfully completed this assessment, you will receive your CEU certificate. We've all been watching as the CDC grapples with the unfolding pandemic. Some of you may have seen these maps. The numbers change day by day, but the maps make it clear that the pandemic has spread around the world and is now spreading across our country. Buildings, of course, are the places where people gather, and many steps being taken to combat COVID-19 involve buildings. Our website, facilitiesnet.com, has put together a coronavirus resource page, which includes articles, news, and links. We will be updating that page as the pandemic continues. The URL is on your screen, and again, you'll be receiving a copy of these slides. In today's webcast, we are fortunate to have two speakers who have in-depth knowledge of important issues related to infection control and emergency preparedness. The webcast will focus on two topics. The first is airborne disinfection. The second is the timeline and process that the Smithsonian Institution followed in responding to the COVID-19 outbreak. Josh Elker from Sterilair will address the first topic. Josh, can you give us some background on airborne transmission and what can be done for airborne disinfection?
Definitely. Thank you, Ed. Thank everyone for attending today. According to the CDC, the SARS-CoV-2 is a respiratory virus. Early reports suggest person-to-person transmission most commonly happens during exposure to an infected person with COVID-19, primarily via respiratory droplets produced when the infected person coughs or sneezes. Those droplets can land in the mouths, noses, and eyes of people who are nearby, or possibly be inhaled into the lungs of those within proximity. The droplet nuclei of respiratory viruses can remain airborne for hours, depending on airflow and humidity. Viruses are very, very small. They are 1,000th of a micron. With that, there are quite a few difficulties. Certain actions generate varying amounts of these droplet nuclei. Previous studies have shown that even just talking generates droplet nuclei, possibly as many as 3,000 in a 5-minute span. Coughing generates approximately 3,000 during the act of coughing, and sneezing potentially tens of thousands, if not more, with remarkable velocities. No wonder we're told to cover our mouth and our nose with our elbow when we cough and sneeze. The simple truth is that people generate droplet nuclei containing viruses frequently and often. Once the droplet nuclei are released, many things can happen. Some fall immediately. Some then remain suspended for a few minutes, and others then remain in the air indefinitely. The temperature, humidity, and airflow will affect all the survival and infection potential of airborne viruses. Coincidentally, indoor environments typically have less humidity, which has been shown to increase droplet nuclei suspension and therefore spread. In the places we live, we work, we eat, we exercise, we watch sports, the things that we can do to protect ourselves from airborne disinfection, there are things that we can do to protect ourselves from airborne disinfection. ASHRAE, the engineers responsible for all things HVAC, have laid out three different strategies, three collective technologies for disinfection of airborne pathogens like coronavirus. Those are ventilation, filtration, and UVGI, ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. Rigorous scientific studies with quantifiable results have reflected the efficacy of these airborne disinfection tools. Potential other methods and technologies for indoor air quality or airborne disinfection do not carry the same fundamental evidence, and they are then not supported as alternatives. Ventilation is relatively simple. It's a pretty straightforward strategy with some great tricks. How we move air in a building can have profound effects. Technologies like laminar flow hoods are able to prevent sweaty surgeons from dripping into your surgical site. Filtration is another tried and true technique that captures particulates. Filters have their limits, though, as nearly all viruses are too small for even the most advanced filters, like a MERV 17 to MERV 20 HEPA filter. But luckily, the viruses in the form of droplet nuclei can be larger and therefore captured. So still, these filters have their limits. A 24-inch by 24-inch or 2-foot by 2-foot filter combating 800 CFM and an average particulate count of 100,000 particulates will be impacted by 80 million particulates in a minute. And even if we're giving it the benefit of the doubt, saying that it has a 99.99% efficiency, where realistically it's 99.97, still 8,000 particulates will pass in that minute. In the given span of a day, that is well over 11,500,000 particulates or viruses that will theoretically get through even the best of filters. Furthermore, mold, bacteria, and viruses can live on filter mediums. Neither the filters nor ventilation actually kill microorganisms as their main strategy of protection. Which brings us to the third tool. The third strategy laid out by ASHRAE, UVGI, ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. The usage of the UVC wavelength for destroying microorganisms. That's what we're going to discuss. The wavelength being referenced is specifically 253.7 nanometers, as you can see on the chart in front of you, which happens to be also the peak value for destruction of ozone. UV light creates dimers or lesions in genetic material, specifically pyrimidine dimers, in certain quantifiable DNA and RNA molecules. Additionally, modern disease control has a long history with UVC, dating back into the 1870s for use against tuberculosis. Even with a Nobel Prize being awarded in 1903 for work with UV on disinfection. And again in 1909, UVC was utilized effectively and studied in the field for airborne disinfection. As recently as 2003, after the first outbreak of SARS, UVC was reinvestigated and recommended again as a frontline tool against pandemics and bioterrorism. UVC has been independently tested against innumerable pathogens, including SARS-like coronaviruses. There are understood formulas that can be applied for disinfection. UVGI is even more widespread in water treatment, and unlike chemical cleaning, it will leave no metabolites and is a physical disinfectant. But we're in desperate times, and that can make for bad decisions. In times like these, many companies will prey on people with false claims. Certain technologies like ionization and oxidation for airborne disinfection have not yet passed the burden of proof. They're not endorsed by ASHRAE. And just as recently as last week, certain ionization companies were claiming on their websites and social media that well and understood UVC technologies generate ozone and couldn't perform in HVAC conditions, contrary to what has been established by ASHRAE. ASHRAE has established zero ozone guidelines for UVC for over a decade. A professor of engineering at Penn State, during this quick online back and forth, was quick to squash the public lies and deceit, offering a shameful tone in referencing the ionization claims as pseudoscience as best. UVGI has a long and studied successful history of protecting us from airborne or waterborne diseases. Like anything else, though, it needs to be engineered correctly. In these unprecedented times, we thankfully have science to rely on. The burden of proof has stood the test of time. Filtration, ventilation, and UVGI, when engineered and applied correctly, can and will and have disinfect and protect us from infections like COVID-19. Dan Davies from the Smithsonian will be up next, and he'll be discussing the steps, protocols, and decisions they have taken in these unprecedented times and in response to this COVID-19 pandemic we're dealing with. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Josh. I just got myself an education. There's a whole lot of information there. What I'd like to talk about today is what Smithsonian has done at the facilities level since this outbreak in China about 3 months ago. So let's see, that in the right place. So at the time of the outbreak, we were already sort of in flu season, right? We were at a time when typically in the annual year you have flu outbreaks, and so we were already preparing for those kind of things. So we had things like hand sanitizer stations that were deployed in various places. We were still open to the public, naturally. Nothing had been gotten very exciting yet. But we were starting to focus, because we were hearing about the corona outbreak, on what we should do to better address people's concerns, the general public visiting our buildings. Restrooms were not initially included in deployment of hand sanitizers because I think it's still recognized that soap and water is the best solution for personal protection. And so hand sanitizers weren't deployed there. And entrances were initially excluded just because we were focusing on areas of assembly, areas of hands-on exhibits, things of that nature. So then as time goes by and we get into February and things start to look exciting with respect to the spread of the coronavirus, the Smithsonian overall started to take a closer look and deployed a team to begin our planning and response, both internally and to our public. And so we started looking at things like ad hoc telework agreements, enabling staff to work from home, utilizing the social distancing philosophies that were being discussed at the time. We built a COVID-19 website so we could communicate internally with all staff on developments of strategies and response to concerns. We developed a resource account where everyone who had a concern could send their issues and questions to one place for an appropriate response. And then those responses were consolidated into a daily outreach for everyone to be able to get the same information at the same time in one place. We did things like assessing inventories of cleaning supplies and the rates of consumption of those supplies, because as more and more folks were reacting, the supply chains were becoming stressed, and our traditional materials were becoming scarce. We developed a deep clean team plan that would potentially be deployed if we thought we had a positive test result of a staff member or a visitor on site. And then we began looking at what would happen in the event that we had to reduce staff, and that would involve either staff working at home, teleworking and otherwise, or our own facilities management staff staying away from the work site in order to do social distancing or just a reduction in the required workload. So first we were at full staff. Going into March, we were at full staff. The building was still open. The visitors were still coming at the rate they do in early spring. And many of the Smithsonian staff were still on site. Not a lot had gone to the telework mode yet. So we were at full staff. We also developed a plan for a 50-50 essential emergency staff deployment states where as more and more people were teleworking and potentially the buildings were moving toward closing to the public, that we wouldn't necessarily need to have all the facilities management staff on site. And in order to enable them to be better socially distant, we would reduce the staff on site. And the third plan was to go to a skeleton crew, which meant that because even when the buildings are closed and there is no visitation and virtually no Smithsonian staff on site, we still have to maintain an appropriate environment for preservation of the collection, and critical systems need to be operated and maintained on a daily basis. So skeleton crew would still have to be there, and security would still have to be there, and we would still need to take care of systems that are needed to support those staff. So those are 3 levels of deployment plans that we initially developed. And then, even though we had a fairly involved 50-50 plan, as time went by and we approached the need to close the Smithsonian to the visiting public, we sort of leaped over the 50-50 plan and went directly to a skeleton crew. So we went from full deployment in sort of the second week of March to closing the Smithsonian on March 14th and went directly from full staff to a skeleton crew. And so all during that time, from mid to late February through early March, one of the keys, as I discussed before, was the gathering of information and deploying of responses to concerns and questions to our staff through our central systems. And this is an example of some of the notifications that went out just prior to closing the building to the public. So we're just kind of giving people a sense, our own staff a sense of what our strategies were, what we intended to do, the places we're going to continue to provide service, how those services would be provided and by whom, and then just general reminders that washing hands is always the best plan, in addition to social distancing and any other methods you can use to prevent yourself from becoming or transmitting this virus to others. And then, of course, Smithsonian closed to the general public on March 14th. So on the right side of your screen there is an example of some of the internal communication that came out. This is one example of dozens of different forms of communication that saturated every method we had for communicating with staff on precautions they could take, measures they could employ to ensure that they and others were not transmitting the disease or becoming infected themselves. And in those discussions, we included coordinating our staff processes, our strategies with our Smithsonian staff and what those contingency plans might be for continuing operations, how and when we might reduce or eliminate non-critical services, the modification of restroom access. So in order to contain the effect of the requirements of people remaining on site, we didn't leave all the restrooms open. We started shutting things down and concentrating the cleaning efforts. We limited and staggered unnecessary access to certain areas, again, trying to reduce the amount of exposure of people to surfaces that hadn't been cleaned and limiting the amount of cleaning that had to be done in other areas. We continued our daily cleaning process and disinfection on the areas that were still occupied by staff that had to remain on site. And then we also provided ways for people to reach out to us, both through those central channels and through emergency contact processes, so that anything that was needed could be accomplished in a priority basis. All through it, communication was key. So that central resource where people could ask questions and get issues addressed was essential. It was led by people at the top end of the Smithsonian, but all the way through our Office of Safety, Health, and Environmental Management, our Office of Emergency Management, Facilities Management, Smithsonian Facilities Group, and others. And the information flowed freely, and one of the biggest benefits of it was that it was concentrated. So you didn't have to go to 12 different places to find your information. It all came from the same place at the same time, and you were able to rely on it. So some of the things that were addressed were ensuring that high-risk people of a certain age and potentially underlying medical conditions were excused from their on-site roles. Telework was expanded very early on, including remote desktop, so you could dialed into your own computer on your own desk and get everything you could get to from there at home, and so you could work from home without needing to be on site. Virtual meetings like this one became very popular, and days are filled now with, instead of sitting around a table with a bunch of your friends, you're sitting in front of your computer with all the same folks. So our IT support has been phenomenal. It's been the backbone of everything we're able to do now, and it's all been it was in place initially before any thought of coronavirus. But in the last 3 months, our IT organization has jumped through some amazing hoops to make it available for thousands of Smithsonian staff to get together and do business as usual. We're also sustaining staff resilience for long-term closure. So morale and checking in on people that aren't on site is essential. This is we're in it for the long haul, and we don't necessarily think that we're going to be back to work next week or next month, and so strategies for sustaining folks being away for a long term is essential. But we do have to plan for the next step. So we're already looking at the triggers that could signal it's time to get back into business and bring people back to work and get the Smithsonian doors back open to the program and the visitors, and move on to the future beyond Corona. So that's where we are. I'll say in closing that when we put this program together for the NFM&T conference in Baltimore, I thought that I was current on what we plan to do. And there's been a little bit of time since that was put together, and we've learned a lot since then, and we're still learning every day. And it's through these kinds of exposures that we try to stay abreast of it, share with others what we've accomplished, and while we're sharing, we're learning at the same time. So I'll pause there and turn it back to Ed for Q&A.
Okay. Daniel, thank you very much, and Josh, thank you for your part of the presentation. Members of the audience, now is the time to start asking your questions. We have some questions from the audience, and I'm going to dive right into those. And some of these are for Josh. Josh, with increased filter efficiency, are there enhanced PPE when servicing the filters? On a level, by combating more particulates, there really shouldn't be really any issue in terms of how that's addressed with airborne disinfection. So kind of circling back to what you said, the reality is the difficulties when we start to increase the amount of air that we're filtering, obviously pressure differentials and things of that nature. I am not the person that is going to be able to answer your exact filter issue for what you need in terms of how many particulates and otherwise. But in terms of how it affects UVC, there is no effect whatsoever. So the only thing that we have to be careful with is that the fourth leading cause of death on planet Earth is indoor and outdoor air pollution. So the ability of us to grab as many of the particulates from the air and remove them from our environment has a direct effect on health. Outside of coronavirus and COVID-19, we on an everyday basis should be trying to remove the most amount of particulates we should from our air. And so that's kind of where I stand on that issue. Okay, great. Another question for Josh. Are there portable or temporary UV air systems that can be deployed in spaces without requiring installation?
There are. But with that said, the amount of energy you need to really disinfect a certain amount of a space and where the application needs to be. So the application downstream of a cooling coil offers two different things that are beneficial. Not only are you disinfecting the air, but you are disinfecting what ASHRAE regards as a disseminator of pathogens in a building. So your cooling coil grows bacteria and mold, yeast, and other things. If we look to COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, same thing, is not actually going to be the reason that people die. I mean, it can be the reason, but not directly the reason. What happens is secondary infections bacterial, mold, or other things, or even viral infections, end up triggering forms of pneumonia and then organ failure based on your inability to either recover and or get oxygen to your vital organ systems. And so that's kind of the same thing with influenza. It's not influenza that actually kills people. It's the other infections and the other things that influenza weakens you for. In the United States alone, there will be 3 million people this year that will go to a healthcare facility for knee surgery, for stitches, for something else, and 100,000 of those people will die. The reality is the second leading cause of hospital-acquired infections is people on ventilators, and the same things that are going to be reaping, for lack of a better term, unfortunately, the people that are immunocompromised or have trouble or in healthcare facilities on ventilators with COVID-19 or otherwise are the same things that we normally see with hospital-acquired infections. So to kind of long and short the question, we can definitely disinfect spaces, but if you're not treating your air handling unit or the air coming into your room, you're kind of reseeding it. Every time that you remove the UV device from that room, because you usually do not want to expose people to ultraviolet, C-spectrum light, what you're going to need to do is consider the air that comes into that space as well.
Okay, great. Daniel, a couple questions for you. One, can you please explain how you modified restroom access?
So while the buildings were open to the public, we didn't. The restroom access was sustained. What we did do, however, and I didn't mention this, was we increased the intensity of cleaning and disinfection in all the public restrooms and all restrooms, period, during the period of elevated concern. So as soon as we started to deploy a strategy in early March for anticipating the potential corona presence in our community, we elevated the cleaning frequency. So we went from one deep cleaning a day and then service cleaning throughout the day in restocking and so on to at least 3 and sometimes 4 and 5 deep cleanings a day on all high-touch surfaces. And that's not just restrooms, that was all other areas, from door handles to railings to elevator buttons to escalator handles, you name it. The things that people were touching, we were cleaning on a regular basis all day long and then disinfecting. Which another comment I would make about the cleaning and disinfection process kind of goes back to a little bit of what Josh was talking about, and that is that in most disinfection recommendations, you will see that there is a very strong recommendation to do a cleaning process first and then a disinfection, and that was our strategy.
Okay, great. Daniel, did you limit security access for visual walkthroughs of spaces for rounds?
No. So partly because we have collections deployed throughout the buildings, and all those collections have to be observed regularly. So security rounds continue, and security is doing those regularly, and so we did not curtail those at all.
Okay, great. Thank you. Josh, back to you with a couple questions.
Yes.
One member of the audience is not familiar with the abbreviation UVGI. Can you explain what that is, please?
Sure. Ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. So that is the usage of, like in this case, it would be UVC for disinfection. So ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. So the germicidal, so destroying the microorganisms or germs, germicidal, and then irradiation using electromagnetic radiation like 253.7 nanometers, the very specific wavelength for UVC light to disinfect.
Okay, great. And speaking of that particular wavelength, what question, will that work on COVID-19?
You bet. So Sterile Air, from a business standpoint, we, because of the fact that not only is mold, bacteria, and virus is dangerous, we gear our systems for usually mold-based organisms. Reason being, mold can take anywhere 50 to 60 times as much energy as viruses. Viruses are very easy to kill with or easy to disinfect in relative scope with UVC. The reason being, Viruses do not have a thick cell wall. They're not used to living in outdoor environments in the same way that you would like a mold living in the soil or otherwise. And so because they're just kind of protein-covered DNA balls that are floating in the air, for lack of a better term, it's pretty easy to penetrate them with the UVC light through the protein encapsulation and target the DNA and the RNA specifically. So as I mentioned before, DNA and RNA have certain areas that we form dimers or lesions in with UVC light. And so those can even be mathematically modeled for each microorganism, and that's kind of where the dosage comes from. The coronavirus family has been tested many different ways with UVC light for well over 30-plus years of experimentation, and then even taking it a step further to understanding how much energy actually disinfects. And for UV in general, that research goes back 60-plus years. The federal government and the Navy in the 1950s was already using UV to disinfect viruses, bacteria, mold like that, and study it against bioterrorism threats. Ironically, you can even view the coronavirus, COVID-19, as kind of a modern bioterror threat. It's not, but that's the same way. Whether it's a pandemic and we're all dealing with it, or it's something that, was released by someone or just happened to occur in the world, we're very experienced at using UV technology to disinfect those types of things.
Okay, great. Josh, another question for you. What is the kill rate for UVC air handling unit installations?
It really depends. So there's a certain energy level that you are looking at. If I could, I don't know, Ed, is our chart still available? Can I use our presentation? Are people still able to look at that? And if not, that's okay. It's just the dosage chart was listed on there. So disinfection for UVC goes by logarithmic reductions. When you're dealing with things that have as high of counts as microorganisms, you start with removing, 10%, and then 90, all the way down, 90, 99, 99, 9. You keep adding nines onto that number. And so the dosage for a 7-log reduction, there we go, thank you. The dosage for a 7-log reduction of coronavirus based on predicted survival, what we understand from mathematical modeling, is down at the bottom, about 6,300 microwatts of UVC. Achieve a 99 and then 5 nines trailing for reduction of that. And so that's a pretty understood number. That goes back to our understanding of SARS in previous outbreaks in the 2000s, as well as historical evidence with other coronaviruses. One of the nice things that UVC in air disinfection has going for it is we also have a sister application in water treatment. And the water treatment business, it's the same type of dosage. There's some small things that need to be calculated because water is a different medium than air. But the amount of energy that the microorganism can tolerate for the most part is relatively static between both. So there's a lot of co-equal science that has plenty of history and understanding with it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question here. I currently have UV lamps installed on HVAC systems. Do you recommend adding ceiling or wall-mounted systems as well? Or is the UV lamp on the system itself sufficient?
It depends on. How much energy you have in your space or in the air handling units themselves. It depends on how often the air is also changed through a building. So let's just give a theoretical example. Say you have 10 people in a building and they're all talking, and we know that you get 3,000 droplet nuclei every 5 minutes. So realistically, if we have those 10 people, we have 30,000, right? But if our air exchanges, 6 times an hour, we should be flushing that through our air handling system, and then it will disinfect them. So it's a combination of how much energy you have and if it's appropriate within your air handling unit. Certain people and certain companies don't necessarily engineer to the same dose as everybody else. I wish it was more standardized, but it is not, and neither is it really through ASHRAE. So with that, it depends on how many times you cycle your air through. You can never be too safe. We have healthcare facilities where not only do we treat air handling units, but we treat the ducts themselves. And even the upper air spaces. All 3 of those strategies are recommended by ASHRAE. They all have their benefits, and they all have their drawbacks and kind of what you can achieve with them. But long and short of it, if you have enough energy and enough air cycles and your air is exchanged in your rooms, within a time frame, you should not need any other sort of in-room disinfection. The reality being a lot of the what's going to occur when someone coughs or sneezes is going to be within that 6-foot range and that social distancing we talk about anyway. Certain amounts are going to remain aloft in the air, but how many and what that load is really just varies.
Okay. All right, Josh, another question for you. Would UV be effective in HVAC applications with air velocity at 500 feet per minute and above, and what residence time is needed for it to be effective?
Yeah, so it depends on, again, the strength of your UV system. So I can give you an example that, in a typical sterile air system on a, 50-inch by 70-inch system with, we designed to a very specific energy field that I can get into a little bit here for mold-based organisms because they're much harder to disinfect. And removing the biofilms on coils, there's also an energy savings component and the ability to remove HAIs. Hospital or healthcare-acquired infections. So typically, across our emitters on a given second could be anywhere from 30 to 40,000 microwatts. When determining flyby at 500 feet per minute, you're going to get probably 0.2, 0.3 seconds. But we also don't know the time that we also have after it gets past our emitters. That is the time exactly at the UVC array. Flyby is determined by average dosage, something that has 30 to 40,000 microwatts like that. Average dosage for that 500 feet per minute be closer to about 9,000 or 10,000. Obviously, in looking at just the approximate math, which would give you well beyond a 99.9999% removal. You really don't need much energy in the grand scheme of things to remove large percentages of coronavirus or COVID-19. Realistically, to get a 99.9% removal, you just need 2,700 approximately microwatts of UVC in a given second. And at our emitters, it's close to 20,000 or 40,000 because mold species take upwards of 400,000 microwatts to disinfect. So by gearing your systems for a whole other issue that we deal with, kind of segueing real quickly, the Seattle Memorial Children's Hospital had a handful of kids die from aspergillosis or mold that came in contact with them, and they kind of failed to keep up with their air handling systems and were sued over that. So it's kind of what I'm saying is if we're not paying attention to the mold and the bacteria as well, we have a problem. And the ability to kill viruses is a lot easier than killing mold and bacteria. So you should be able to, how much energy is in your air handling unit, should be able to determine how effective you are at disinfecting.
Okay, great. Thanks, Josh. Daniel, a couple questions that I'll send your way. This is a general question. If there is a confirmed case of COVID-19 in an office building, what protocols should be followed to ensure the cleaning and disinfection is handled properly and safely? I don't know if there's a policy from the Smithsonian that maybe talks to that.
Not necessarily a policy, more of a procedure or a protocol. Okay. But just piggybacking on what Josh has just been talking about, things are airborne for a while. So if somebody is actually positive in a space, one of the first protocols would be to close the space and let it settle down. And so the virus will be present in the air if that person has been coughing or sneezing or whatever for a period of time. And so just letting things settle first is probably a good strategy. But then the process for cleaning depends on what you're cleaning. So one of the concerns we have in the Smithsonian is that in our castle, for example, we have a lot of historic furniture. And so if someone shows up as a positive test result in a space that is full of furniture that can't be made wet or can't be easily disinfected, then time is probably going to be your best factor, and it takes a while for the virus to break down on its own without disinfectant. So that's a challenge. But in a space where you can do a disinfectant procedure, it's essential that staff use appropriate personal protective equipment, that they're not inhaling anything that's airborne, and then that they're not getting the disinfectant on their skin. So using appropriate gloves and other PPE to protect themselves. And then the cleaning process, again, is first, because soap is one of the best destroyers of the cell wall of the virus, followed by disinfectants that are appropriate for the surface. I hope I got to your answer.
Okay, great. Another question, Daniel. Can you point to any references that can help facility managers write a pandemic mitigation plan?
So, in the facilities realm, there's, especially in the last month or 6 weeks, there's a slew of information out there. I would always recommend people start with Centers for Disease Control recommendations, World Health Organization recommendations, but then in the facilities realm, IFMA has great guidance, facilitiesnet.com has great guidance, APA has great guidance. There's lots of information out there available to help people develop protocols for response.
Okay, great. And Daniel, another one for you. How are you paying at-risk staff?
Everybody is on the payroll.
Okay.
Everybody's on the payroll. So the people that are working are working. People that are teleworking are working, so they're on the regular full-time job.
Okay.
People that cannot work because they don't have telework, or they are at risk enough that they need to be excused, are on what we're calling weather and safety emergency leave.
Okay. Thank you. And I will put this up here for Daniel first, and then Josh, anything that you might want to add. There are a number of questions about how long the virus survives on different surfaces, on paper, on hard surfaces, and a question, I think, Daniel, I think you said waiting a while can be a good thing in terms of getting a building disinfected. And people are, I think, trying to grapple with the question of how long does the virus survive on different surfaces? Is there anything you can point to that can help people address that question?
If I'm starting, I would say the jury is still out. There are variables there. Certainly, it survives longer on surfaces that are not absorbent. Surfaces that are absorbent, the chemistry of the virus breaks down faster in an absorbent surface where the hydrogen atoms start to interact and with the surface. On a hard surface, whether it's marble or stainless or especially copper, it can last considerably longer. Initially, I was saying that the whole issue of delaying is as much an issue of letting the larger droplets that may have been cast into the air from the individual are settling out. But as Josh has indicated, some of the finer droplets are going to be in the air for a prolonged period of time, depending on how the air is circulating, how often it is exchanging, how it's being filtered, and what else is happening in the airstream. So those are all variables, and it's why if anyone is going into an area that's known to be contaminated, they'd want to use the appropriate PPE to protect themselves.
Okay, great. Josh, anything that you might want to add to that?
Yeah, there was a pretty fantastic podcast. There's a Dr. Osterholm from the University of Minnesota who is kind of like a forensic epidemiologist, or one of the foremost experts on actually studying these types of outbreaks, and he actually wrote a book. And then the funny thing is, one of the final chapters of his book, he circles the wet markets in Wuhan, and this was a year ago that he published it. Says, yeah, this is where it's going to come from. But in his conversation, he mentions that these are respiratory illnesses, and so we need to be careful about surfaces. But the vast majority of how we are going to get sick is not from the surfaces, and that's what Dr. Osterholm kind of reiterated. We need to be careful because it is a vector and it can be transferred that way. But the reality is these viruses need to get into our nose tissue, potentially our eyes, and into our lungs. So if you're touching a surface, then you have to touch your face or your mouth or your nose, or they somehow have to get there, right? I mean, unless you're just taking a piece of cardboard and running your nose all over it, it somehow has to find a way, onto you or into you. And I saw someone had mentioned, just as one of the brief questions in the bottom of the screen, take out food and should we be careful of things like that. I think you should take some precautions. But at the same time, Dr. Osterholm basically said that, the surface stuff is it gives people something to feel like they're making a difference and they're able to help themselves a little bit and feel like they're in control. I think one of the scariest things about this is you can walk into a space that somebody left 10 minutes later and breathe the air they did, and we can get infected. And I think that's the scariest thing, that we just don't have much control over whether we get infected or not by coronavirus if the space is occupied with people. So, take every precaution we can. And surfaces are going to have different times in which they last there. But one of the tough things and this plays into the science as well, just because you can find a virus present on somewhere does not mean it's viable. Using potent PCR testing, the polymerase chain reaction testing they do does not always do a great job of dictating how viable it is. It just lets you know that there's DNA present there from that virus. So there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. I know in some of the studies they've nebulized some coronavirus are similar to it in certain spaces and tested on different areas. But then culturing those is always a difficult premise as well, and seeing how long they last. So I still think the jury's out. And with that, we need to take every precaution we possibly can. Okay,
great. Thank you. A couple other questions for you, Josh. I think you kind of addressed this. There's a question about how often would you recommend to use the UVGR method in a facility that can't close down, like a police station? And I think you said it depends on a lot of factors, but I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, so if this is in the air, we need to. So we have promoted for 25 years. Sterile Air has had 25 years of combating airborne disinfection and being in that market space. And we always promote 24/7, 365. Whether we are, keeping a coil clean or something like that, the reality is, as your air cycles through a building, as we know, there's viruses. So if you're in a police space, I think one of the best things you can do is to make sure that your air, a place like that, make sure that your air is consistently being exchanged, and that you have something like UV, disinfecting it with filtration and ventilation, and you're being smart about that. And if you do have certain areas within that police station that aren't used for a day, or you want to, clean surfaces and otherwise, there's a lot of techniques you can do. You can use UV, you can use other forms of disinfectants, chemicals, and other things to disinfect those spaces smartly. But the reality is, if it's a continuously occupied space, and we're trying to stop an airborne transmission, we need to be recycling that air consistently with technology like UV filtration and ventilation to remove the most amount of particulates that we possibly can. If people are coughing, sneezing, doing all those things, they're going to generate droplet nuclei, and our ability to disinfect those as rapidly and as effectively as possible is going to limit the amount of transmission to the best of our abilities.
Okay, great. And just to kind of follow up to that, there have been a couple questions about other HVAC measures for occupied buildings, like increasing outdoor fresh air, increasing filtration to MERV 14, things like that. Can you speak in general to how all those pieces fit together?
Sure. ASHRAE still recommends that outside air, and as much outside air as you possibly can bring into the space, the better you are. With that comes an energy cost, though, right? The temperature of the air outside is oftentimes not the temperature of the air we'd like inside. We then have to deal with the fact that we're removing particulates from it. There's a whole lot of factors that go into consistently using outside air. There are a couple other technologies in the airborne disinfection space that claim to be ASHRAE approved and claim to clean the air, so you don't have to use as many air exchanges. And they do not have the actual standard or backing of ASHRAE. They just reference it and say that they follow those standards. So it's one of those things where we got to be careful in what we read. We got to trust the tried and true things. According to the people that design HVAC, using more outside air is beneficial. And if you think about it this way, if I'm recycling air within my building, we're going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in our building naturally as well. And as far as I know, carbon dioxide, even as high as 1% increase, can lower your mental faculties. So the ability to bring fresh, clean outside air and then filter that air as well as disinfect it, and then put that in our buildings for people is the best that we can do, and that's what ASHRAE stands by.
Okay, great. Let me just see here. A question: is it possible to make the air too sterile? Are there, if we're going to UVGI equipment, can the air be too sterile? Are there other things people should be aware of?
No, there's no such thing as too sterile of air, because the people that live in occupied spaces are going to add a ton to it. Every time a door opens in your building, I mean, it's a constant battle. One bacterium becomes 20 trillion in a given day. So we're losing anyway. It just so happens that we have robust immune systems, and then we come in contact with something like COVID-19 or coronavirus, and it's a game changer, right? So there's no such thing as too sterile of air for us to breathe. Trust me, there's plenty of microorganisms that are going to find their way in, but we have to do our best, and that's why technology that removes 99 with a series of nines after it is really that critical, because you could be combating 1 million, viruses floating in the air. It could be 10 million. I mean, some of the numbers that we've seen that exist in cooling coils and airstreams and healthcare facilities have 1 million mold colony forming units that are present on those coils and in the air. So in the grand scheme of things, there's no such thing as too clean of air. We think about it like water. We drink about 2 quarts of water a day, and we breathe 20,000 quarts of air. There's just a ton of air that we consistently have to breathe, and having it clean has no detriment to humans in any way, shape, or form. There's plenty of germs everywhere.
Okay, great. Thank you. Daniel, back to you for a couple questions. Are your cleaning staff contractor-based or internal?
It's all internal, although we did when we began looking at the deep clean response to positive tests. There was some thought to augmenting our internal staff, which are fairly highly trained, with contracted support. We haven't yet gone to that, haven't yet needed to, but we're prepared to do that if we need to.
Okay, all right. And then did you do any temperature checking of employees before they came into work?
No, we haven't. We haven't done that. We allow people who think they might have some health concern to self-identify. We have not gone to temperature checking of employees before they arrive at work.
Okay. A forward-looking question. What is a proactive plan as we get ready for the future to have people come back into their buildings, and how to assure them that the facility is safe?
Well, interestingly, just the way when we began planning the potential for the arrival of COVID-19 and how we were going to shut down and stagger our staffing and implement remote work and so on, we had several steps in that process. We're thinking that there will potentially be at least several steps, if not many steps, in the resumption of normal business. And some of those may fall by the wayside or be overtaken by events, or it'll sort of depend on what the requirements are and how this thing dissolves and moves off, and we return to something that feels like normal. So that we're in the planning stages now of what those triggers could be and what the scenarios are for those triggers, and what our response to those will be in each of those cases. And of course, that's like a budget. Once you get there, you'll react and respond accordingly and make adjustments along the way.
Okay, great. And then, Daniel, another one for you. This is a follow-up to the question about cleaning protocols. This is specific to an office setting, but I imagine it could apply to really any building. Should the entire floor be shut down? And what about common areas leading to the area that had the confirmed case?
So somewhat depends on how the air in the space is circulated and what the path of the person who's deemed to have been infected has taken. So one of the things we like to try to do is determine who is where, and we're doing that now. So when anyone who is on site at the job site shows up, they're where they are and what they're doing is tracked fairly accurately, so that if we come up with a positive test somewhere along the line, not only do we know where they were and what they may have contaminated or what might have been contaminated by them, but also who else might have been exposed to that. So that's almost more important than how far we do the cleaning. The cleaning is going to be done wherever people are. So right now we've closed down a lot of the areas that are commonly used by multiple groups of people, whether it be break rooms or things like that, so that they aren't getting contaminated. But the ones that are used and paths between them are going to continue to be cleaned.
Okay, great. Josh, back to you for a couple questions.
Sure.
There were a couple questions about biofilm. Is UV effective at penetrating biofilms?
You bet.
Okay.
Yeah, Sterile Air has been designing systems to disinfect biofilms for 25 plus years. Biofilms, if people aren't aware of them, anytime you have water on planet Earth, it's going to be seeded by usually fungus, yeast, bacteria. It's going to form a gluey matrix of polysaccharides, so sugary chains, amino acids, and other. And what it forms, you can think of it as like a microbial city. And then what it does is it offers actually protections from chemicals that you may use on it, from other types of things. And even taking it a step further, there's cross-transfer of genes. So when a bacteria dies, it basically rips itself open and throws its DNA out into the air. So what you can have, and this occurs in healthcare facilities as well as in the air, is what you can have is bacteria will actually take a non-pathogenic bacteria will die and leave its DNA in the air, and then a opportunistic pathogen like staph infection will grab that bit of DNA, and if that non-pathogen happens to have something that makes it resistant to an antibiotic or otherwise, well then now you have staph that is gaining that. So you have these biofilms that basically are a breeding ground for antibiotic resistance, as well as they have mechanical cooling issues. So if it's on a cooling coil, it's 1,000 times less effective at transferring energy. So UVGI is incredibly effective at removing biofilms. We just have to gear our disinfection to what's actually in those. And so mostly it's mold-based organisms that we need to disinfect. So it requires a magnitude of energy level that just needs to be considered. And once you kind of achieve that amount of energy, the biofilms, and Sterile Air has been doing for 25 years, you actually see them on a cooling coil start to slough off into the drain pan. They almost form like black little pellets that keep kind of falling off and disappearing away. So yeah, I mean, the biofilms are biologically active microorganism colonies, and UVC has excellent effect on them. It just depends on if you have 5, 6, 7, 8 inches of biofilm, it might take a while to get through. If it's a couple, if it's a hundredth of an inch or so, it's going to be a lot quicker and a lot more effective.
Okay. If a portable UV GCI is used, what forms of protection should the user wear?
Sure, yeah. So you have to be careful. You have to cover your eyes. So even just the glasses that you wear are enough to protect your eyes. 3 millimeters of plexiglass will protect you from UVC. UVC is really not that hard to protect yourself from. The key is you want to cover your skin. Any place in your skin and or your eyes you'd like covering. So whether that be just like a Tyvek type suit or something like that, even surgical wear will be fine. You just don't. There's actually at Duke University they perform surgery with UV lights shining down above, even in certain burn units because of candida yeast strains that cause a lot of problems with people who have severe burns. They actually will UV the wound site. Damage from UV, even if you were exposed to it every day, the chance of it causing anything carcinogenic is actually very, very small. Going outside on a day-to-day basis is going to be more harmful. With that said, there are some physical effects from getting exposed to UV. It's very similar to a welder's splash. UV will not penetrate into the deep part of your eye. It stops at just kind of your cornea, won't get to your retina. But with that said, it will cause some scratching type feeling on your actual eye itself. Very similar to a welder's flash, which you will heal from. It's not a fun couple days. At the same time, any exposure on your skin will go away very much like a sunburn. except you don't get the cool tan from it. It just kind of it just doesn't feel very comfortable. You kind of have a similar effect. So UV is definitely something you have to take precautions with, but accidental exposure is going to have absolutely zero consequence on your life in any way, shape, or form, outside of maybe an uncomfortable day or two.
Okay, great. A question is UV protection installed on the supply or return side of the HVAC unit?
Downstream being that way you can treat the entire coil all the way back through, and then you get everything as it flies by after that point as well. So you are then getting the downside of a reservoir of pathogens, and then you also get all those pathogens as they fly through. So it creates a control point within your HVAC system for not only that surface that we discussed, but then your airborne transmission as well. And that's also a place where you're going to get air recirculating through your building, so it offers the redundancy of air circulation as well.
Okay, great. Well, we are a little bit past our time here. Daniel, I'm going to throw one more question out for you just because it's kind of an interesting question. I don't know if you'll have a real answer, but someone wants to know what's the best way to address social distancing in elevators?
Take the stairs. Take the stairs.
Yeah.
So one is not to put your fingers on the buttons. So use your sleeve. But yeah, literally, if you're approaching an elevator that has several people in it, you might want to wait for the next elevator. There's no other option. You're going to get into a box that has multiple people in it for several minutes, and you're going to share whatever they share.
All right, great. Well, Daniel and Josh, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. Members of our audience, thank you for your participation. As I said at the beginning, you'll be getting an email with a link to the slides from the presentation. And with that, I will close today's webcast.
Thank you, everyone.